Concurrently, with all of the erupting violence along various lines of contact and axes of advance pertaining to the local Trojan shock forces and external components of the invasion forces, the installation of Fort Bliss was already being saturated by a heavy missile and artillery barrage from predominantly longer range 155 millimeter WS-35R shells, which were a very new and advanced satellite-guided, rocket-assisted 155 projectile with an incredible range of some 37 miles, being fired from the two divisional artillery battalions of the PLA's 48th Infantry Division, a subcomponent of the much larger 14th Group Army, as well as rocket artillery fire from the PHL-03 Battalion of the 148th Artillery Brigade of the 14th Group Army, firing its enormous long-range PHL-03 fired 300 millimeter rockets into the installation, in addition to the 155 artillery being fired by the much closer 48th Infantry Division as it fired regular HE shells and also the rocket-assisted long-range satellite-guided projectiles into the main post. In addition to this, the Pakistani artillery fire from their own 14th Infantry Division of their armies, of the Pakistani armies, two artillery battalions fired their American-made M198 155 millimeter howitzers at the 1st Armored Division's 1st Brigade. This brigade, consisting of a mechanized infantry division, a brigade engineering battalion, two armored battalions, and a cavalry squadron, along with a support battalion and the HHC, or the Headquarters of Headquarters Company, encapsulating the brigade's command elements. As the ISR capabilities of America had been completely annihilated by hard kill systems such as DN2s and 3s and S500s of the Chinese and the Russians, respectively, as well as the massive cyber attack that eliminated and crippled the American military networks and anything else connected to the internet, such as the grid, the internet access throughout the land, as well as the telecom network and more, in tandem with the cyber strikes, totally left the Americans deaf, dumb, and blind, along with the local electronic warfare assets of the 14th Group Army's 14th Signals Regiment, which encapsulated an electronic warfare battalion specializing in jamming portable radar systems such as those used by the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade's Patriot batteries and the THAAD battery remaining on the post, as well as the SINGARs and other radio systems utilized by the American forces, as they could pinpoint the origin of these signals and jam them in turn, leaving the Americans little ability to communicate and organize. Hence, it was now up to local commanders to make critical life or death decisions pertaining to the forces under their direct command. And this included no less the 1st Armored Division's 1st Brigade, its Brigadier General already having had made up his mind minutes into the invasion that upon being shelled, that he was going to have his forces break out in an attempt to reach the nearby Rocky Mountains and interstate systems at the Las Cruces Highway Junction, a critical highway junction with ample CCP regime properties, including a major supply depot along the way, which was guarded by an entire Pakistani Combat Engineer Battalion, a mechanized infantry battalion here, and one on its southwestern side of Las Cruces, all being on CCP properties where they were stationed as Trojan shock elements. As the invasion was underway, these forces began, who were initially at training of live fire training and conducting battalion-level snap drills, or the American equivalent of such, as the Russians called them, as these drills were to test the readiness of their units in a combat situation, as it was a show of force, as this was a active military post literally right on the border, and the international hostilities were so high that the command of the post had raised the REDCON status of the installation, or the readiness condition. Although not all units had made it to their armories to sign out all of their weapons and equipment as per their vehicles and crew serves and their small arms, many units did and had since been completed with their pre-maintenance services and checks upon all of their units' vehicles, and had mounted up and had prepared to move as far as it related to moving to the training areas to train, with the 1st Brigade already being in the far northern training areas, the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade having had set up in the closer in training areas to the main post, Biggs Army Airfield, East Fort Bliss, as well as other areas of the post just beyond. The 2nd Brigade had been since under attack by Trojan elements of another additional combat engineer battalion of the same 14th Infantry Division of the Pakistani Army, as well as another mechanized infantry division, while the Biggs Army Airfield was currently under attack by one of the 2 armored battalions, as well as another mechanized infantry battalion, rapidly smashing their way deep into the post and now engaging American forces of the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division at the Biggs Army Airfield, just to the north of the main post. As all of this was occurring, a salient had begun to form, and the outermost tip of the salient were 2 tank platoons who were scouting ahead, reconning ahead, as they had to do this in order to be able to have runners literally run back from their tanks to tell the next group of forces, who would then send a runner back to the forces behind them. They established a chain system in terms of the runners in order to spread vital messages and orders between the different commanders of the different units of the 1st Brigade. Its Brigade Engineering Battalion, with its combat engineers, one of its armored battalions, were holding the southern portion of the salient, while the mechanized infantry battalion had moved ahead and begun to mix with the other armored battalion and its Cav Sqdn in the far north of the salient. Although the Cav Sqdn's 1 field artillery battery of M109A6 Paladin self-propelled howitzers was already at the edge of the northern live fire training area, conducting live artillery fire into a portion of the White Sands range for live munitions testing and firing. As this was occurring, the rifle companies of the Cav Battalion or Squadron and the armored or heavy companies of the Cav Sqdn were likewise mixing with elements of the mechanized infantry and armored battalion also in the area, beginning to push outwards ever so slowly. As 45 minutes into the entire invasion, the outer tip of the salient, where their 2 lead tank platoons were scouting ahead and sending information back to warn of the dangers they were now encountering, had early on been destroyed, as to shore up the line around the salient to contain it, as this could never be allowed to occur successfully, as in allowing American forces to reach either Las Cruces or the mountains, where they could establish a guerrilla-type campaign against the logistical and supply routes of the invasion forces, the externals. These forces needed to be contained and destroyed as quickly as possible before advancing further in to clear the rest of the post, with the other elements of the Trojan shock forces and Chinese externals of the 48th Infantry Division moving up from the south to slam the proverbial door on the southern portion of the installation upon defeating its 3rd Brigade, who had moved into the city upon the commander's initiative to try to stop the invasion at the border itself. This utterly failing, as the 48th Infantry Division had by that point showered the city in munitions from its divisional artillery battalions, 2 of which firing 155 HE shells into the city, and their longer-range, rocket-assisted WS-35R satellite-guided munitions into the main post, in addition to the artillery brigade of the 148th Artillery Brigade firing its 1 PHL-03 heavy rocket, 300mm rocket fire into the installation as well as the entire missile barrage from the Tu-95 fired salvo of KH-55 and KH-101 long-range cruise missiles, having fired them hundreds of miles away as they approached Big Bend in Texas. These cruise missiles showered the installation, mainly being used as part of the KIA'd operation against the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade, all of whom's batteries were already now set up and deployed throughout the training areas of the post, the innermost training areas. And along with Chinese-fired tactical ballistic missiles and Iranian-fired Shahab-2 tactical ballistic missiles, in addition to the Chinese-fired cruise missiles mostly of the Ch1neae variety of subsonic cruise missiles, long-range cruise missiles, in addition to their hypersonic DF-100 cruise missiles, all were used in the KIA'd operation, as well as to hit critical command and control buildings throughout the installation, as well as motor pools and even many living areas of the soldiers and even their on-post families. These major barrages certainly had a morale-crippling effect, as they eliminated multiple thousands of people within this first 45 minutes alone of the fire, as this fight began 45 minutes into the invasion as a whole, as these forces began to push out in an ever-growing salient. As this mechanized infantry battalion of Pakistani infantry within their Al-Fad wheeled APC and IFV versions of the vehicle had already surrounded and destroyed another portion of American militiamen, roughly 190, within a pocket, which were also part of the militia that was being pursued by the high-value target elimination or capture mission undertaken by the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion, of whom itself was being airlifted into battle by the Transport Helicopter Battalion of the 141st Aviation Regiment. These forces were now called from eliminating this militia pocket to shoring up the line at the salient and protecting the artillery battalion, one of 2, which was actually deployed from its original CCP properties to forward areas on high ground to fire deep into the installation, with its forwardmost battery literally next to a valley wherein the American lead 2 tank platoons had been advancing through. There were 2 major segments of this salient battle that will be explored. The tank-on-tank battle in the northern portion of the salient between the Pakistani Armored Bttn and mixed units of the American Cav Battalion and Armored Bttn, as well as mechanized infantry elements that forged ahead and mixed with the armored battalions, other elements, its other companies in the salient, in addition to the Cav Sqdn's one artillery battery already being at a live fire range at the time of the invasion's kickoff. The tank-on-tank combat that occurred in the north of the salient will be explored in the next video. However, the point of the salient, there erupted a large battle between the Pakistani mechanized infantry forces, along with its most forward deployed artillery battery of the 5 firing batteries and 1 headquarters battery that made up the artillery battalion. Although the artillery firing from here, their M198 towed 155 millimeter howitzers were firing further into the installation and not anywhere on this battlefield, as that was left to the further afield firing batteries of the artillery battalion, who were offering their fire support to this portion of the battlefield. This area at the tip of the salient, a mile away, the first American tank platoon that was scouting ahead through the valley floor had since been destroyed by heavy fire from these 2 advancing companies of the larger mechanized infantry battalion called into the area, being this battalion here, to shore up the line along with the artillery forces. 1 mechanized infantry battalion in the southern part of the salient, its companies split up and holding different portions of the salient. This battalion holding its portion. The Air Defense Artillery Battalion, not involved directly in the salient battle, but was protecting the flanks to the north, was being engaged on its CCP regime property as its troops, armed and equipped with their small arms and their air defense Chinese-made Type 59 57 millimeter air defense guns, were utilized against the attacking American reactionary and militia forces, the militia forces coming from outside of Alamogordo and the reactionary armed civilians linking up with them and advancing to ostensibly try to meet up with military forces and assist them, but were instead engaging several CCP properties occupied by these air defense batteries comprising this air defense battalion, and were repulsed by the air defense battalion before the battalion sent a company ahead to clean up the area. While all of that was occurring, the salient battle was erupting, and the MiG-31 squadron, as the Russians had 3 different aircraft squadrons operating in the area, their Tu-95s having successfully have launched their standoff cruise missile systems and flying over the area before an RTB, or return to base, before circling the battlefield, as well as the air superiority oriented Su-57s, fighter aircraft, which could still strafe ground targets with their nose cannons, as well as drop their 2 KAB-500 munitions that each carried, as well as the MiG-31 strike aircraft, which were heavily laden with air-to-ground ordnance, being their KH-58 anti-radiation missiles, which could hit any building or vehicle with a radio set or anything that emanated radiation or radio signals, which could be a radar or even communications equipment. They also were armed with KAB-500 laser-guided air-to-ground munitions, as well as their originally fired 1 apiece KH-47 hypersonic missiles, which were fired on the KIA'd operation, all of which were fired at KIA'd targets. Many at the THAAD battery, as that was the most critical of all, as it could have potentially maybe stopped a few of the incoming tactical ballistic missiles, although that was completely annihilated by DF-100s and the Kinzhals or the KH-47s fired from the air. The battle was heating up 45 minutes in and onward as the salient had been enclosed by these Pakistani forces before they were attempting to go drive deeper into the base and clear the installation of any type of armed resistance conceivably possible. On the edges of the salient, as this mechanized infantry battalion had finished cleaning up rapidly clearing this area of the militia civilians, they were called in to shore up the line, and shore it up they did. As the very tip of this salient was at an intersection of two valleys. There was a northern ridge and a southern ridge with a valley in between, as well as a large ridge that essentially boundaried the valley running up from the southwest to the northeast. Where these valleys intersected, a bloody battle had erupted as the Cav Sqdn's 1 artillery battery was already doing live fire artillery training, as evidenced by their position on top of this ridge where they would fire over the boundary of the post and into the live fire area of the White Sands ordnance range, missile range, and other ordnance testing. They fired their howitzer shells at the advancing Pakistani mechanized infantry column of one company on the southern side of this valley, whereas on the northern side of this valley, another company was moving up. There was yet another company on the southern ridge and another company on the northern ridge, along with the forward deployed artillery firing battery of the local Pakistani artillery battalion within the area. It's 5 firing batteries, this being one of 5, with their towed M198 155mm howitzers. These were trucks, their field artillery supply trucks, which carried their shells, primers, fuses, and powders, and they unhooked them and rapidly had set them up, all 8 of them. Their whole battalion having 40 howitzers, so between both divisional artillery battalions, they have a total of 80 howitzers of the 155mm variety. The mechanized infantry companies were being supported by their own mortar company, firing their LLR-81 French-made 81mm mortars, as each mechanized infantry battalion had its own fire support company within it, a mortar company, typically. And these mortars were splashing all over the battlefield, in addition to air support from 3 Russian MiG-31K strike aircraft, firing their KH-58 anti-radiation air-to-ground missiles, targeting M1A2 Abrams tanks, as well as dropping their potent KAB laser-guided air-to-ground munitions upon their targets, all while the further afield Pakistani artillery firing batteries fired upon the American artillery battery in their suppression of enemy artillery operation, or their C operation. This was critical to eliminate this battery. As the Pakistanis shored up the line along the salient, they did suffer decent casualties, at least in this engagement within this 2 by 2 mile area, with the Southern Valley-based mechanized infantry company moving into the area, having lost 4 of its vehicles, consisting of their Al-Fad APC and IFV versions. They lost 1 of the Al-Fad IFVs, and they lost 3 APCs, and they had lost another APC of the Al-Fad to an M1 Abrams tank. The company on the northern side of the valley likewise lost 2 vehicles, an Al-Fad IFV and an APC, to M1 Abrams tank fire. And although the shells fired by the artillery battery right off the bat, they only had 1 volley, and they bore-sighted their howitzers, literally looking through the bore down into the valley, and fired them down off of this high ridge deep into the valley over a mile away, and their shells, 2 apiece, hit here, here, and here. And as they splashed the area, they eliminated this entire company of dismounts moving alongside the vehicles of their company. As they reached here and the shells splashed in the area, all 10 of these dismounts were annihilated by the American shell fire. Although in turn, although they had time to get out 1 volley of shells, in turn, they were annihilated, totally crippled by the return fire from Pakistani artillery, as all of the artillery fire was Chinese drone directed, as there was again an orbiting WZ-8 high altitude stealth recon drone orbiting the entire installation, which gave it a commanding view over the whole facility and everything in it. And the Pakistanis were given precise coordinates which were relayed to the FDCs of each firing battery, which in turn passed down the fire missions, which were hurriedly carried out. As the American artillery battery of the Cav Sqdn was decimated, including even the range safety building at the end of this road here. Down here was an administrative building with squads of troops taking cover around it. This squad in the prone position in a wedge formation, and this one in a rolling T formation, being targeted by Pakistani 155mm artillery, as well as being strafed by Russian MiG-31 fire, as seen here with the nose cannon. Missiles were likewise being fired of the KH-58 variety at various vehicles, such as here and here, as well as here, 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 and down here. The KAB 500s were dropped upon these American M1 Abrams tanks and follow-up troops of the mechanized infantry forces that were mixed in with these armored forces of these 2 American battalions. And actually, there were 3 different battalions, subunits operating in the area, when including the Cav Sqdn's artillery battery at the live fire range on the top of this high ridge, as this here indicates a steep incline, a ridge line. These ridges over here were likewise highly elevated off of the valley floor, with hills atop this ridge, and over here another steep ridge. And although the ridges would gradually have a lower gradient as they move down to lower elevation, the units of the other Pakistani mechanized infantry companies got high up on the ridge line to be able to offer anti-tank system fire from their dismounts, who wielded Chinese-made HJ-08 anti-tank systems purchased in bulk from the Chinese, as well as their stocked-up Al-Qaton anti-tank rocket systems, which were quite advanced when compared to earlier simple shoulder-fired anti-vehicle weapons like classic RPGs, or like an RPG-7 or a Type 69 Chinese equivalent, or the American AT-4, which was a recoilless shell, an 84mm shell. This Al-Qaton was a 100mm Spanish-made shoulder-fired anti-tank rocket that could actually effectively destroy a tank as its penetrative power was 700 millimeters of RHA, the classical measurement system for determining strength of armor, and it could penetrate the armor of any modern battle tank. The Alcaton was a Spanish-made shoulder-fired system and was quite advanced, as its aiming system was a ballistic computer and laser rangefinder integrated into the sighting system, as ordinary light anti-tank weapons did not have this and were iron-sighted, more simple weapons. On the southern ridge was another mechanized infantry company of the same battalion brought in to shore up the edge, the tip of the salient. Further up was the destroyed 1st tank platoon that was leading the whole procession of American forces, which now became an unwieldy, disorganized force as the combat broke out, as it was already difficult enough to maintain command and control over these large forces without adequate communications, as these were being jammed by electronic warfare. There was no satellites to speak of, and the military networks had been crippled. So the Blue Force Tracker and newer iterations of systems like that were completely out of the picture. There was no combat data links of any kind available on the American side, as the satellite and military networks were down from the tandem anti-satellite strikes and the cyber attack. The electronic warfare systems wielded by the Chinese and Russians in different areas of the invasion likewise jammed all the redundant systems and radars, portable radars that were generator powered and independent from the military networks, the internet, or the satellites. These MiGs did incredible damage to the attacking American forces trying to break out of the installation. Here ran a simple chain link fence topped with 3 strands of barbed wire that was the outer edges of the post proper, which on the other side was the White Sands area where artillery was fired at from the artillery range. And the American forces had already smashed through the fence in various points, including right here, and here, as this tank busted through here, and here, as well as here, where this tank smashes through the fence, and also right here, as this single tank made a break for it to smash through the fence to try to get out of the area, as they were taking heavy fire from the close air support provided by these MiG-31s from their strafing of the nose cannons, their dropped laser-guided ordnance, which destroyed ample vehicles and troops in this area, as this tank, all of these dismounts, this APC, and this APC, the M113, these were all totally destroyed by the KAB, or the Cav 500s that were dropped, including more dropped here, 2 more here. And there was also mortar fire, again, from the Pakistani's own mortar companies within their mechanized infantry battalions, as there were 2 different mechanized infantry battalions in the area, one coming from the north here, and the other one coming in at the edge, at the tip of the salient, clearing this whole area. As the artillery fired by the Americans did fairly decent damage to this one company of the battalion of the mechanized infantry in the area, as there were a few more mechanized infantry battalion or companies of the battalion off map. This battalion had already suffered 5 vehicle losses and 1 severely damaged from the artillery and Abrams tank fire. And although the Americans were frantically trying to maneuver through the battlefield, even getting so desperate as to avoid the close air support to race down the steep inclines into the valley, they were engaged by hunter-killer teams of the 23 dismounted Pakistani mechanized infantry squads from these two companies moving into the valley here. Although not all 30 of their available dismounted companies were dismounted, with only 7 still mounted up in their different vehicles, the 23 were moving through this area, and there were other dismounted companies on these ridge lines on the northern ridge here and the southern ridge here. As you can see, there are ALFOD, IFVs, and APCs. Even one of their headquarters companies, MRAPs here, a Max Pro MRAP, another American-made vehicle that the Pakistanis had bought over a decade ago, as well as their dismounted troops on the edge of the ridge in the prone position, firing everything from Ch1 anti-tank missiles to the Al-Qatans to even their Type 69 Chinese RPGs or their light anti-tank systems, while their potent 40mm autocannons of their APC ALFOD versions and their even stronger IFVs with their 105mm cannons fired at everything that moved on the battlefield in conjunction with the close air support and artillery fire from their own artillery, as well as mortar fire. Little by little, everything throughout this entire battlefield was totally annihilated as this platoon of 4 infantry vehicles of mechanized infantry forces, these American vehicles, these M113s and Bradley, were completely smashed by artillery fire here, 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 and here. And as were their dismounts that had already since dismounted and ran to take position here, as 2 additional Pakistani mechanized infantry companies were moving into the valley through the north, through this northeast to southwest valley here, where these 2 valleys intersected at like a T intersection. This was a 2-by-2 mile battlefield. It was a somewhat large area, at least as a segment of a much larger battle. And this facility had been totally shelled by Pakistani artillery, as these were already shelled. These indicate that an imminent artillery strike from the time the map is shown is coming in. There are so many things going on at the same time on this map, it's difficult to articulate them in any coherent order. So I can go from south to north and show that these KH-58s flew down, destroyed these tanks right off the bat with strafing fire at this one, severely damaging it, although it managed to limp and smash through the fence. These tanks were already destroyed early on by fire from up here on the top of the ridge from these dismounted troops firing HJ-08s and Al-Qatans, and these hunter-killer teams became one of the most effective parts of the Pakistani infantry forces' doctrine as far as their battle doctrine, as they dismounted these hunter-killer teams in advance of their vehicles, as their vehicles would sit much further back and provide fire from many meters away, roughly staying in a typical instance of staying approximately 300 to 500 meters behind the advancing infantry, so as to be able to make the most of their longer distance and ranged weapons while staying further back and minimizing their ability to be hit, while allowing their infantry to go forward while supporting them with their longer range fire, while their infantry would get close and conduct their hunter-killer team tactics where they would go tank hunting with their anti-tank systems, such as earlier shown, this Al-Qatan system being fired in the earlier depicted battle at the main post, as shown, these being Pakistani mechanized infantry dismounts, full squad. This one firing is Al-Qatan. And these forces, moving in their wedge formations, classic attack formations, would bound and cover tactically together, mutually supporting each other with their small arms fire and anti-tank fire, and would do their best to bound and cover while simultaneously maneuvering around a target, such as this crippled tank hit by some of the strafing fire, which smashed through the fence, as this squad of this platoon moved around, hugging the side of the ridge, while this one bounded here. And as this one bounded here, this one came around this way, and they both fired anti-tank weapons from different angles and destroyed that main battle tank while in their wedge formations, as their wedge could watch different sides at one time. Like, they could watch, literally, it looked like an arrow looked. One side of the arrow this way, one side this way, the point man straight ahead. And they mutually supported each other in that type of tactical maneuvering, as well as the mortar fire being called in diligently by the mechanized infantry to their mortar fire support company, who would drop the mortars as close to target as conceivably possible, sometimes doing grave damage to lighter armored vehicles or outright destroying them, as well as eliminating ample numbers of American dismounted troops, in tandem with the artillery strikes occurring all throughout as well. A mix of artillery and mortar strikes from the Pakistani's own artillery battalion and its different firing batteries that comprised it, firing from further behind their forward battery, which their forward batteries firing even deeper into the post, right over this battlefield, while the ones further off the map fire into this area to provide their support. As the Russian air support, their close air support, was withering away the enemy forces, as the Americans were pummeled by missile strikes in the form of the anti-radiation Kh-58 air-to-ground missiles, the KAB-500 laser-guided bombs, and more, including strafing. These forces had been chipped away quickly, and at the very beginning of the hostilities, as shown, these munitions had been dropped, these fired. Same with this aircraft firing its 4 Kh-58s, dropping 2 KAB-500s on this area down here, completely annihilating all of these vehicles, which were simultaneously engaged by Pakistani artillery and mortar fire. As you can see, this arrow is completely surrounded in orange and blue, indicating that the Russians and Pakistanis were firing and destroying these forces at the same time of these APCs and IFV in the form of Bradley. Over here, similar occurred when these APCs and Bradley, this one being destroyed by Russian strafing from this MiG-31K, and the other 3 surviving vehicles moving up only to be shelled, mortared, and hit by ranged fire from the now moved in place rest of this company, having had moved vehicles forward here, and some over here, with its surviving essentially 2 remaining combat platoons worth of vehicles, being 10 vehicles, moving them in those 3 different prongs, along with their infantry mutually supporting them, having had called artillery on the advancing Americans coming down, these 2 surviving APCs, these 2 M113s moving down. They were being fired upon by the Pakistani vehicles and dismounted infantry forces, and an artillery strike called in when this tank and dismounted mechanized infantry were likewise shelled, along with these grouping of vehicles here being hit by the Russians and the Pakistani artillery and mortars all at once, and ground fire. They directed the same on these forces. This M1A2 with the infantry following behind in a rolling shield maneuver, and this M1A2 moving here, and those 2 surviving APCs moving here. They were hit by artillery, hit by ground-based anti-tank missile systems, HJ-08s, Chinese-made, and the Alcaton, Spanish-made anti-tank weapons, as well as rocket-propelled grenades of the Type 69 variety and mortar fire as indicated here. This APC had moved ahead and was hit again by mortars, and this tank moved ahead and was hit by the ground fire from anti-tank systems to artillery to mortars, and as well as the fire from the Al-Fads as well, 105 millimeter shell fire and armor-piercing 40 millimeter fire, which completely ripped up Bradleys and M113s like it wasn't any big deal, like it wasn't any kind of thing. Completely shredded them apart into hulks of smoking, hole-filled metal that sat on the desert floor in the valley. As these dismounted infantry forces, having already since dismounted their vehicles, moved into position here and here, with their vehicles moving forward and being struck from the vehicles on the southern ridge, as well as the vehicle fire from the forces now here, and the dismounted infantry squads, which, along with two of their Al-Fad APCs with 40 millimeter autocannons, were moving into position here with this squad and this squad. There were two squads along with two of their APC vehicles moving here in this big arrow. And these dismounted forces, upon their vehicles having dismounted them and moved up to provide fire against the advancing Pakistani forces, they were engaged by the Pakistani APCs firing their 40 millimeter autocannons and coax 7.62 machine guns, as well as the two dismounted infantry squads using small arms against them, simply overwhelming them, totally destroying this dismounted squad that had since maneuvered over here. And you see the arrows completely encapsulated in orange. It's been destroyed. This one, being hit on its sides by all the fire, surrendered. The survivors surrendered and the wounded, and were taken POW. And as these tanks were destroyed outright by the close air support, along with many of these infantry troops as shown, the survivors were likewise captured alive, as there were a few survivors from this squad and this squad and this squad. This whole squad surrendered intact, while the wounded from survivors from this squad and this squad, the three left of this squad, had surrendered as well, and they were taken by these two Pakistani infantry squads that advanced here and cut off the southern end of the valley where the ridge began to move up here. They cut off the southern end of the valley after having smashed through the fence. And as these forces were captured by these forces surrendering to the APCs, the two APCs and the two dismounted infantry squads from back here, this squad and the two vehicles that went this way, the other vehicles that were here of the two remaining combat platoons that were here and here continue to maintain their fire on the area, as there were still some forces left that hadn't been completely annihilated. Like these forces here, there were three surviving vehicles that moved into the area but were hit by artillery and mortars and then destroyed, as well as fired at from the ground down here and from the north. Early on in the battle, happening at the same time as many of these movements in this area, with all these squads hugging the ridgeline and moving forward, with these squads here, three squads forming a almost diamond formation in this area. As this squad was moving in to complete the diamond, this diamond formation would have had fire for all directions, as they were all in the prone position, firing at these advancing American dismounted forces, these dismounted forces, and all of them were annihilated. As the diamond formation, when this squad finally closed the loop here as they advanced into the area, and then there was this squad in the prone position at the bottom of this small hill firing up at them, And this squad having moved in and opening fire on them, along with their anti-tank systems, having destroyed this Abrams early on, these forces were completely defeated and crushed, along with the Russian close air support having annihilated this entire group, along with Pakistani-fired systems from on the northern ridge, as well as these troops here in the valley, and their fire support from their company moving into position here, firing their ranged weapons up this ridge line. There was a road that went through the valley floor and uphill to where this headquarters platoon was, and they were heavily mortared and shelled by Pakistani artillery. All their vehicles destroyed in this artillery and mortar barrage right away, as indicated by the artillery markers. Artillery, mortar. After all these were destroyed, and early on, these tanks, again, these were all mixed units. They weren't in any specific order from a tactical standpoint. I mean, some maintained their platoon discipline and stayed together, but this whole tank company up here wasn't in any particular formation, and the tanks started to kind of move on their own at first. And as this tank moved here, these forces here in this diamond, what became a diamond formation, fired anti-tank weapons up into the bottom of the hull as it rolled forward and came near the hill, moving down from this area. They fired up and destroyed the tank from laying in the prone position and firing their Al-Qatan at the bottom of the tank. Again, they had bulked up on these systems, the Al-Qatans and HJ-08s, for this specific battle, as they knew they would be facing heavy armored forces, and they were fully aware that the redcon status of these American forces had been raised due to it being a border installation, and thus were expecting a fight. And although this battle was over relatively quickly at the end of the salient, at the tip of the salient, it was still a vicious battle from the standpoint of the Americans getting out a few shots before they were completely annihilated from the air and from the ground. The Russian close air support being a decisive factor, as it had destroyed multiple vehicles, dismounted troops, including the tanks and the Bradley IFVs and M113 APCs. These vehicles being destroyed by a KAB 500, and these being destroyed by other companies advancing into the area, similar to how these companies advanced into this valley. The end of this valley was being advanced into by elements of this mechanized infantry battalion, whereas the one that moved into the edge of the salient here after defeating these militia civilians were they who held the end of the valley from the tops of the ridges and into the valley floor, who came around and seized and enclosed the bottom of this valley, this southwest to northeast valley. And the forces moving down from the other mechanized infantry battalion, its subordinate companies, one here, in two columns, as well as another breaking through and swinging into this area to support the advance of these two, and these forces closing in of these companies totally encircled and destroyed the very edge of the salient. As this training area, once an artillery training area formally with the range safety building and an administrative building for the ranges right here at the edge of this road with its parking lot, and a training range road that wrapped around and past the fencing of the perimeter of the post, was now a wasteland littered with destruction and death, with charred, hole-riddled vehicles and smoking hulks of metal laying everywhere throughout the valley floor. Even some of it being the Pakistani vehicles either destroyed by the American artillery fire and some of its troops outright wiped out, as well as the vehicles destroyed by M1A2 Abrams tank gunfire, such as this Al-Fad APC, this Al-Fad IFV, and Al-Fad APC, leading this company. This company lost 2 vehicles, while this company lost 5 and had 1 badly crippled. The armored recovery assets of this Pakistani mechanized infantry division came and recovered and pulled away the crippled vehicle as it could be repaired and put back into service, while the other vehicles were simply far too gone to be retrieved and were left where they were. As the Pakistani forward artillery battery, which had been bolstered by these mechanized infantry companies of the moving in mechanized infantry battalion coming to block the edge of the American advance into the valley, were at one time in jeopardy, but now had been relieved and were therefore able to continue firing their fire missions deeper into the installation and into the larger salient as a whole, as shown on the larger map, with this battery firing deep into the salient, hitting elements of the combat engineers, the now moved in place mechanized infantry forces, which were scattered about with the other battalions, and the other forces continued to fire their artillery as well from the other firing batteries into the northern parts of the salient. As the salient was being little by little smashed in back towards the main post and the northern training ranges, other battalions of mechanized infantry came down from the north on the left flank of the armored battalion, while the artillery battalion fired over this mechanized infantry battalion, with this one blocking the edge and pushing it back in. There would be no breakout for the American forces of the 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, as their salient, their attempt to break out of the installation, was doomed to failure, as the superior ISR capabilities of the Chinese, their coalition allies, enabled the Pakistanis to utilize all the real-time intelligence to completely counter, parry, and destroy any American attacks out of the installation, thereby neutralizing the threat as far as it related to Las Cruces and the mountains and the interstate system, and continuing on their advance into the post to clear the remainder of it, which would occur after the hard-fought battle at the north of the salient and within the southern parts of the salient as well by this battalion here of mechanized infantry, whose subcomponents, its mechanized infantry companies, were holding the line in the southern part. But the bigger fighting was definitely on the northern end, as there was a tank-on-tank battle that erupted in the north, which will be explored in the next video, which is the last video insofar as it related to the installation fighting, as upon the destruction of the salient here, and largely the 1st Brigade of the 1st Armored Division, all the main fighting around the posts would have ceased, allowing for the coalition forces to clear the rest of the post of any surviving personnel who didn't perish in the savagely brutal artillery, air, and missile strikes, as well as to ensure that there would be no remaining threat from any type of active military elements on the installation, which would lead to the total rapid securing of the entire local interstate network for the external forces to complete their mission and move north. But there was more fighting to come, because even beyond the fighting in El Paso and in the installation, there was fighting occurring in the mountains conducted by the Special Operations Battalion, the Stalking Leopard Special Operations Battalion of the 14th Group Army, as well as the PAP's battles, as by now, over an hour in, their artillery had moved in and set up a new firing position after having fired for a half hour at targets along the border, before moving inland to set up a new firing position to fire on other targets being attacked by the two different prongs of the PAP forces, now moving deep into New Mexico, who were about to reach their next armed civilian targets. Aided in the area as far as ISR, not only by their own platoon-level quadcopter recon drones and also satellite data, but also by the orbiting Ch-4A armed recon drone, which was able to fire air-to-ground missiles at targets called in by the ground forces, in this case the PAP, as this drone was specifically assigned to their sector of them clearing the flanks of the vital road junction of Las Cruces. This was a major battle in terms of a strategic objective and, of course, the local tactical objectives that were being pursued by these smaller units, but it all came together to provide a grand strategy picture of the entire battle as it related to both the external component and the Trojan shock army component in this specific battle, as each had their own vital mission to ensure that their portion of the invasion went smoothly. And even the most potent, most powerful unit in the 14th Group Army itself, as far as like combat forces were concerned, the 144th Armored Division, it wasn't even committed to the fighting, as by now, an hour in, it was already advancing into New Mexico, as its troops were now on the winding roads of New Mexico, heading in towards the major interstate junction at Las Cruces, New Mexico, before moving north on I-25 to secure that route by being on it and also becoming the leading spearheading element of the soon-to-convoy total force of the entire 14th Group Army upon the completion of the neutralization of the enemy forces in and around the post, including in the mountains and to the west in the desert. Also, with the 18th PAP Light Armor Brigade falling in behind the 14th Group Army, only to head north to northern New Mexico and southern Colorado to aid the other Trojan shock forces deep inland already carrying out their objectives as they related to the invasion. As the entire invasion was like a grand puzzle with different puzzle pieces that all fell into place. The invasion prong of these external forces that began in Mexico here in the westernmost prong of the south central sector were only one small part of a much larger invasion, although the combat they carried out in this region was some of the most dynamic as far as border battles were concerned, because they were fighting an actual active American installation with active American units on it, which for their part, were well-equipped units insofar as their vehicles and weapon systems, but without ISR, without the internet, without their military networks, without satellites and GPS, they were nothing, and they could do nothing to stop the invasion, and especially against an invader that had superiority in equipment, vehicles, weapon systems, electronic warfare, anti-satellite systems, as well as cyber capabilities and their quality and quantity of vehicles and missiles. There was no chance. Even if they had all of their ISR intact and communications intact, they would still be overcome by a force like this. Only they would cause more casualties on these forces, but nonetheless, these forces would overwhelm and prevail still. But the lack of ISR, the lack of communications, made overcoming the Americans just that quicker and that easier. The next video will be the Northern Salient Tank Battle, followed by the fighting in the Rockies against the American militia with the high-value target apprehension, followed by the small battle of Deming conducted by the PAP forces later in the battle of the El Paso Fort Bliss area, as this was a 5.5 hour long battle as these externals and Trojans came into the area like a sledgehammer against all armed resistance that the Americans possessed and smashed them into bloody pieces.